Can Chris Eubank Jr. really punish Conor Benn this time? Or will Benn's relentless aggression flip the script? Eubank brings size, reach, and composure at 160 pounds, plus the psychological edge of already outclassing Benn once. With Bomac in his corner, he's sharper, meaner, and fueled by real animosity. But Benn's speed, volume, and hunger make him dangerous. Is this revenge, exposure of boxing's politics, or pure promotion genius? The rematch writes its own chaos.
So can Eubank Jr. really punish Benn this time? Now there's lots of different variables to this fight, but one of the important factors is the size, the reach, and the physical advantages. So when we talk about the advantages, we can kind of break it down into three phases. So we can break down the advantages into three phases. So when we talk about phase one, we're talking about Eubank holds a height reach advantage over Benn, and he's more comfortable handling the power and the heavier weight of 160 pounds. So, the height and reach is significant. So the jab you would think would favor Eubank, and the ability to give and take punishment you would think would be in the favor of Eubank. And in phase two, in their first fight, Eubank outlanded Benn by a wide margin. What was that margin? Well, the margin was 367 to 215 total punches. And when you break that down even further, the jabs was even more significant, 150 jabs to 35 jabs. So you can see that in theory, there should be an edge to Eubank with regards to the jabs. But when you look at the evidence of the first fight, you can see that Eubank threw more jabs and he landed more jabs. And this was significant in the first fight and could be even more significant in the rematch. And then we go to phase three, which is Eubank's punch accuracy was higher and more consistent. His experience in managing distance and controlling rounds gives him room to inflict damage gradually rather than necessarily going for the one-punch knockout. And in this context, size is important. The ability to take the punches at that weight is important. The ability or the reach advantage is important. And the personality of having, or should I say personality or the fighter identity of utilizing the lead hand more frequently is important. But when we talk about the weight, maybe we should give some reference points, because it's important to acknowledge that more weight doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to win. So one reference point is Evander Holyfield versus Riddick Bowe. In the first fight, a tremendous fight, absolutely tremendous fight, Riddick Bowe was victorious and he was 30 pounds heavier. But then in the rematch, Holyfield made adjustments and then he won the second fight, regaining his undisputed championships. Actually, there's a correction there, because I think he regained, was it 2 of the 3 or 3 of the 4? Because I think one of the belts had been vacated at that time due to some politics. But the point is that the first fight, Holyfield lost. He was a smaller man. But in the second fight, Holyfield won. So in one sense, just because you're the smaller person doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to lose. And of course, Riddick Bowe won the third fight. But then we have the recent reference point of Crawford versus Canelo. And Canelo was the bigger man. Both were considered elite boxers. But despite this, Crawford was dominant in his victory. So even though it's important to acknowledge that there is a size advantage with Eubank, it doesn't necessarily mean that he will win or dominate the fight, but it is an advantage. But then there's another element to this fight, and that element is the psychological edge. And when we talk about the psychology of boxing, let's make a reference quickly to Mike Tyson and Sonny Liston. Why are they important to the psychology of boxing? Because often when people fought Mike Tyson, it was said that they had lost before they got into the ring because he was so feared. And equally, Sonny Liston was very feared. So fighting fighters like Sonny Liston and Mike Tyson, there's a psychological element. There's even a psychological element to fighting great defensive fighters. Like you could imagine someone fighting Pernell Whitaker and they're thinking, I'm probably not going to be able to hit this person. And that could either negatively or positively impact your performance. So the psychology of boxing is important. And here's a few things to remember. Eubank enters the rematch with the knowledge that he won the first fight by unanimous decision. So that gives him a psychological advantage there. Additional to this, he's added some strategic adjustments, reuniting with top elite trainer Brian Bomac. And you would think that Brian Bomac would offer, he offers elite coaching and elite boxing environment. And I've often said that trainers are responsible for not just giving strategy, but harvesting environments. And when you look at the situation, you think to yourself psychologically, I guess if you're looking at it from a Conor Benn perspective, the one thing that he has is that he lost the first fight. So he has the motivation and purpose to avenge the defeat. And that could fuel his workouts. It could, it could take him to be the best version of who he is. But can the best version of Conor Benn beat the version of Eubank that we're going to get in the rematch? And what version of Eubank are we going to get? Is Eubank's fusion with Bomac going to enhance his boxing, or could it have a negative impact? And the only way it could have a negative impact is if they don't have the best professional relationship, because I guess there's a hypothetical situation where you can have a great trainer, but if you don't have a great relationship, maybe that could negatively impact your performance. However, the implications are positive because Eubank did have Bomac as a trainer in the rematch with Smith, Liam Smith, I believe it was, and I think that was a very good performance. But of course, there are counter arguments, and you can look at Benn's speed, aggression, and early volume, and then when you look at the weight cut, the rehydration, and the physical toll, when you put those into the mix, and if you add the whole narrative that Eubank saying he's going to knock Conor Benn out, will that mean that he will take more risks? And if he does take more risks, would this play to Benn's advantages? Because I think if there's more punching exchanges, that could potentially give Benn more, maybe not knockout opportunities, or if not knockout opportunities, it will give him more opportunities to inflict punishment and to implement his type of fight. So is Eubank exposing the boxing industry? Is he a hero, or is he simply a great marketer? Here is a question, or here is a sequence of questions. Are we simply selling a fight, or are we selling truth, or are we doing a bit of both? Eubank Jr. portrays himself as the truth teller in this story. He is the hero exposing a corrupt industry in a sense. But is boxing really corrupt? Or is the practice of winning corrupt? Or are just humans corrupt? Now, the Eddie Hearn animosity seems genuine on both sides. Eddie Hearn doesn't seem to like Eubank, and Eubank doesn't seem to like Eddie Hearn. But this animosity is just part of the plot, which is promoting the fight and promoting Eddie Hearn's show on Netflix. Both, if truth be told, are very witty guys, engaging in chess moves. Perhaps both of them are playing chess. And that makes me think, what's more important, being good or winning? But when we look at this, we can kind of detail Eubank's perspective. So the rehydration clause and the weight games, that comes up again and again and again. And by speaking openly about the unfair weight demands and hydration limits, Eubank is highlighting how contracts can affect fights. Obviously, the counter-argument here is that he did sign the contract, and if it was unethical, why did he sign it? But still, even though he consented to the agreement, does that mean the agreement is ethical? The rehydration has become a significant factor in this fight. And also we have this whole concept of business over sport. Eubank has been blunt. The boxing isn't about the best fighting the best, but about money, names, and narratives. This, of course, is something that the fans suspect. And it may not be about the best fighter, but who has the best story or who is the most marketable. However, if you take fighters like Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury, they have the names, they have the worldwide attention, but they can definitely fight. So maybe it's not black and white, but perhaps some people get unfair advantages. But again, is that strictly just in the boxing context? Or is that in the world context? And is Eubank wrong for exposing this? Is he exposing it? And when it comes to boxing politics, it's like he's showing you what's happening behind the curtain. What's happening behind the curtain in boxing? What's really being written in these contracts? Is this wrong? Is this morally wrong? Or is the opposition just trying to simply get an advantage? Because each side desperately wants to win. And what's good in the modern age is that things are so transparent. It's hard to hide things in the dark. It's hard to keep the curtain closed in the modern age. If you do bad things in the dark, if you do bad things behind the curtain, it's more likely to be exposed. It's more likely to come to light. So I guess by Chris Eubank Jr. calling out these issues publicly, he forces the fans to look behind the curtain. Not every fighter and not every spectator is willing to do that. And on one sense, you could say Eubank is heroic. On one sense, you could say he's a hero. He's a warrior. But you could also say, is he a warrior? Is he a man full of character? Or is he just a clever marketer? Is he a warrior? Or is he a marketer? Is he a warrior or is he a great marketer? Because he's created, quite brilliantly, the villain persona. He knows that being polarizing sells, and he's been extremely polarizing. Fans either tune in to see him punish or to watch him punish. Either way, he's winning at the box office. We tune in to see him verbally battle Eddie Hearn and him verbally battle Conor Benn. And above all, it's entertaining. It's presented in a moral way. It's presented that he's showing you things behind the curtain, but the packaging and the execution is extremely entertaining. And of course, Eubank is the soundbite. Eubank is the soundbite master. Initially, when the fight was put on, Eubank stated 60% of Conor beats 100% of Conor Benn. These are statements, these are deliberate statements that are designed for headlines, keeping him relevant and marketing the fight. And let's be honest, like, you're supposed to market the fight. That's part of your responsibility. If you're getting paid a significant amount of money, then part of your responsibility surely is to market the fight and to sell the fight. And of course, we have the family legacy, the genuine family legacy, tapping into the Eubank-Benn rivalry, that genuine rivalry in the 90s, keeps not just a storyline, but a generational storyline alive. And that in itself is marketing gold. It's marketing gold because it's true. It's true. People have witnessed this. They've experienced it. For some people, it's part of their childhood. It's part of their memories. So it's a brilliant marketing machine. And as we know, drama sells fights. The egg slap, in one sense, cost Eubank economically. But in another sense, it could have doubled the pay-per-view sales. The trash talk and the theoretical confidence, they're not just bravado. They're ticket sales. They're ticket sales strategies. So in a sense, I haven't made my mind up about Eubank. In one sense, I do think he is heroic. He has stood up against the system, and I commend that. And he's raising real issues, but at the same time, in an intelligent way, he's raising those issues. But in doing that, he's generating more interest in his brand, in his fights. And therefore, by telling the truth, he's actually making more money. Here's a question. Where does the authenticity end and when does the performance begin? Or is it a combination of authenticity and performance? Obviously, the mystery keeps it very marketable. But whether Eubank Jr. is whistleblowing or showboating, the outcome is the same. People are talking and the seats are selling. So will Bomac improve or hurt Eubank's performance? But wait a minute. If you get an elite trainer, surely you'll get an elite outcome. Well, let's begin this by looking at good trainer relationships. Now, Canelo Alvarez had Eddie Reynoso, and Canelo always had Reynoso, but after the Mayweather fight, which was a defeat, he doubled down on technical improvement. Because of this, they focused on head movement, counter-punching, and patient pressure. And Canelo became undisputed at 168, one of the sport's biggest attractions, and was, a massive fighter that was celebrated for their popularity and for their performance and their elite level performances. You can say that the Canelo-Reynoso relationship was an outstandingly positive one. Let's keep going. Let's take Manny Pacquiao and Freddie Roach. Pacquiao was raw. He was very raw before joining Freddie Roach. Freddie Roach developed. He developed his jab, he developed his backhand, he developed his ring intelligence, and he helped him climb through multiple weight classes. Pacquiao became an 8-division champion. And let's be honest, a total global superstar. He is seen in the Philippines. He is adored. And that was a fantastic relationship. Freddie Roach was able to identify the potential and realize the potential. And, I feel like Pacquiao was someone that, he appears to be a respectful person, but he clearly had respect for Freddie Roach. He followed the protocol and he implemented the strategies. And in fairness, Freddie Roach, I think one of his skills is not just being a brilliant strategist, but again, being able to harness that elite boxing environment. But of course, then you have what could be seen as negative relationships. Amir Khan. Now, Amir Khan was he was so fast. I really liked watching Amir Khan. He was such a fast fighter. And if you look at Amir Khan's career, he switched trainers a lot. He worked with Freddie Roach, and then he worked with Virgil Hunter and others. And let's be honest, those two names, they're elite trainers. And each trainer naturally tried to fix the flaws because every boxer has flaws. So they were trying to deal with the defensive lapses. But one would argue that the constant changes that prevented the continuity that was essential for Amir Khan. And some would argue that it hurt. It actually hurt his career. And then, of course, we have Anthony Joshua. Now, I would say that Anthony Joshua had a brilliant working relationship with Rob McCracken. And they won the title and they regained the title. So that's brilliant. But since then, he switched trainers to various trainers. Robert Garcia, great trainer. Derek James, another recognized really good trainer. And again, each trainer brings different adjustments. Some will be safety first, some will be aggressive, or some will opt for more slick boxing. But critics argued that this lacks stability, and this in effect, it affected his boxing identity. It affected his confidence. But at the same time, he lost twice to Usyk, who's considered by some to be one of the greatest boxers of all time. So did Joshua lose his identity, or did he just fight a totally outstanding fighter? Or is it a combination of both? It's a hard one. It is a hard one. And his new trainer, Ben Davidson, I think is a really good trainer. And I think he looked really good against Ngannou. But obviously then there was his performance against Dubois. And it'll be interesting to see what happens now. Will Ben Davidson be able to input not only the strategy, but harvest the boxing environment necessary and be able to raise Joshua's confidence to be able to perhaps get him to reclaim the title? Only time will tell. But some people would look at, obviously, the Robert McCracken trainer relationship was positive, but then there's a lot of doubt on the other relationships. So you can, in theory, have an elite trainer, but not have an efficient relationship. However, Bomac is an elite trainer. And with elite trainers come elite level tactics. So when we look at the positive implications, Bomac masterminded Crawford's pound for pound rise. So he has an eye for game plans, and he could really structure, he could bring a structure to Eubank that could be beneficial. Remember, he masterminded Crawford's pound for pound rise, not just the fight against Canelo, but his whole rise. So, he's proven at the elite level. Of course, Bomac brings sharp fundamentals. Eubank, in the past, some may say, has relied on grit and athleticism. Again, that's a bit of a narrative bias, but maybe there's some truth in that. But what Bomac can do, he can polish the jab, implement the distance control and the defensive discipline. And to be honest, Eubank did show some of that under Jonathan Banks, but he can consistently hone that in. And also there's the mental edge. Training alongside the likes of Crawford brings the mindset. It brings a championship mindset, a winning mindset. And the question would be, if you are training amongst elite champions or an elite champion, will that elevate your game? And clearly the answer to that could be yes. And that confidence and professionalism could sharpen Eubank's focus and make him better. Or it could encourage Eubank to bring the best of himself. And then we have the adaptability in the ring. Crawford is known for mid-fight adjustments. So if Bomac can instill even part of that adaptability, Eubank becomes harder to beat. He becomes harder to beat. So there's clearly some potential positive things, but are there any negative things? Well, Eubank has been switching trainers a lot, and What happens if you switch trainers? What happens, or what can potentially happen when you switch trainers a lot? It could affect your identity. It could unsettle your rhythm. And can too much change be negative? And if the answer to that is yes, then we might have an issue. Also, one may argue that there might be a style clash. Bomac, he tries to build slick, cerebral fighters. Case in point, Crawford. But Eubank historically has thrived on volume and toughness and intensity. So is there a risk of overcoaching him out of what makes him effective? However, the caveat to that is that Eubank is becoming a more intelligent fighter. And then the other thing would be the short time together. Is there enough time to build an effective chemistry between the fighter and the trainer? Surely building effective chemistry takes not months, but years. So this could affect. So on the surface, Eubank hiring Bomac is a great idea, but there are some variables. There are some variables that could potentially negatively affect his performance. But I think if you're wanting Eubank to win, seeing Bomac in the corner is a big, big plus.
Who rules boxing's pound-for-pound throne? Bivol, Inoue, Usyk or Crawford? Bivol stunned the world with wins over Canelo and Beterbiev, entering matrix mode against a dominant champion. Inoue, Japan's monster, blends power and artistry with cultural weight at home. Usyk, a genius southpaw innovator, conquered cruiserweight and heavyweight alike, toppling Joshua and Fury. Yet Crawford, the switch-hitting maestro, finally cemented global impact by dismantling Canelo, proving brilliance, dominance and creativity make him boxing's number one.
Okay, so who is the top 4 in the world? In my mind, you got to look at Inoue, Usyk, Crawford, and Bivol. So let's go from number 4 all the way to number 1. So for me, number 4 is Bivol. Now, Bivol's victory over Beterbiev was astounding. In the second half of that fight, he went into what I call the matrix mode. And when a fighter goes into the matrix mode, it's like they go to another level. It's like they're on 5th gear and now they've gone to gear 12. I think in that fight, which was the rematch, he really showed something that was truly special. He dominated a dominant champion. Beterbiev could generate such power with short hooks, with short trajectory of punches. He was devastating. And to be able to compete and to be able to excel and to be able to beat such a dominant champion, you've got to respect Bivol and understand that he's an elite fighter. Now, the one thing you can say about that fight is that the cultural impact of that fight is subjective. Some people say the pay-per-view performed badly, but should that affect Bivol? The fact is that Beterbiev was serious competition. You could argue that Beterbiev is an elite fighter. He was a feared fighter. He was a feared power puncher, but he also had underestimated technical ability. So I think you have to give so much credit for that performance. And I think if you look at Bivol's CV, he has 2 outstanding victories. The performance over Canelo and the performance over Beterbiev. They were both, I would say, objectively elite fighters. So he's beaten 2 elite fighters, Canelo and Beterbiev. And for that reason, he deserves his number 4 slot. Additionally to this, Bivol has a great jab. He has great boxing intelligence. He may not have the most power, but he has enough power to get your respect, and he has great accuracy, and his ability to go through the gears. In that second fight, he showed that he was able to really go through the gears. And I think he's definitely deserving of that number 4 slot. Now, for me, number 3 is Inoue. I've been talking a lot about Inoue recently, and his dominance and power at the lighter divisions is not just remarkable, it's what makes him stand out. It's very hard to be a power puncher in the lighter divisions, but he does that. Now, some critics may say that he doesn't have a cultural impact with regards to a worldwide appeal, but he definitely has a massive cultural impact in Japan. To make a comparison, in Britain, Joe Calzaghe was a British legend, but some would argue that he didn't have the same worldwide appeal. So it's like some boxers will have a cultural impact in a country or countries, but may not have the worldwide cultural impact, but they still had a cultural impact. And to my understanding, Inoue is a massive celebrity in Japan. Inoue also has great punch creativity, a great jab, a smooth 1-2, and he has good boxing intelligence. He's able to adapt to the opposition. I think the issue that Inoue has is that he hasn't had the same level of competition of Bivol or Crawford or Usyk. He hasn't had that dance partner to take him to the elite level. I've said this before. When you think of Muhammad Ali, you think of the dance partners. You think of the dance partners. You think of Sonny Liston, Joe Frazier, George Foreman. These are dance partners that evolve your career. One of my favorite fighters, Evander Holyfield. When you think of Evander Holyfield, you think of the fights with Riddick Bowe. What an amazing trilogy that was. You think of the fights with Mike Tyson. These fights elevated his career. And you could kind of ask the question, what are these fighters what does the career of these fighters look like if you take away those dance partners? But to play devil's advocate, just because your competition is not popular does not mean that they're not elite fighters. So one could state that no, Inoue has 4 elite fighters. They're just not popular fighters. But this for me is what puts him at the number 3 spot. But he definitely deserves that spot. And I did a video on it. I believe he is the greatest Japanese boxer of all time. Phenomenal fighter. I have Usyk at number 2. Now, of course, Usyk had domination of the cruiserweight division, but he also has domination of the heavyweight division. His victories over Joshua and Tyson Fury definitely increased his cultural impact. He is an exceptionally intelligent fighter. He figures out the puzzles. No one's figured out his puzzle, and I believe he's introduced cognition drills into the boxing game. He has brought an innovation which hopefully will be duplicated by other boxing camps. He has a great southpaw jab, and he can always take it to another level. It's like he starts off in the 2nd gear, but then he can go to the 3rd gear, he can go to the 4th gear, he can go to the 5th gear. He's an exceptional boxer, and by all means an exceptional human being, definitely deserved of his number 2 spot, and many will still have him at number 1. Now, for me, number 1 is Crawford. Of course, the Canelo victory had the cultural impact that was needed for his resume. You could ask the question, is Crawford the best switch hitter of all time? It's a good question. Of course, Crawford has incredible punch creativity, not just from the southpaw position, but also from the orthodox position. He has incredible boxing intelligence. And again, this is a person who can just go through the gears effortlessly. Crawford has a unique ability. He has a unique ability to make elite boxers look very, very ordinary. And he has a total commitment to boxing, and that commitment is undeniable. You know what? When you think about it, it's actually hard to remember when Crawford was in a competitive fight. When was the last time you saw Crawford in a competitive fight? Now, from my perspective, this is just my perspective, before Canelo, he lacked the cultural impact. But after Canelo, that painting was complete.
Terrance Crawford's greatness can't be measured by wins alone. It's about the nature of his victories, the competition he's faced, and the cultural waves he's made. His dominance over Canelo, watched by over 41 million, was equal parts technical brilliance and fearless ambition. Like Sugar Ray Robinson, Jack Johnson, and Joe Calzaghe before him, Crawford blends skill, intelligence, and impact. Whether he's top 10 or top 20, all time is subjective, but he's already a living legend.
So where does Crawford place on the greatest of all time list? Where does he place? Now, I would argue that being on that list isn't just about winning. Hear me out. It's about the nature of your victories. It's about your competition. It's about your cultural impact. Let's give an example. When Crawford beat Canelo, that fight had a cultural impact. This is evidenced by the fact that over 41 million people watched that fight. Additionally to this, there was a technical dominance and a bravery. You might ask the question, what do you mean a bravery? Well, the bravery was for Crawford to take the fight because he had to come up in weight. That was the bravery. He took the risk to be great. And his technical brilliance, let's be honest, it was absolutely inspiring. Now let's briefly go through history to make some references. Now many people in the boxing world consider Sugar Ray Robinson to be the greatest fighter of all time. He had it all. He had elite footwork, a high boxing intelligence, a great jab, great combinations, and he had wins over multiple Hall of Famers. Additional to this, he was a headline draw. His opponents demanded big money to fight him, and the best pound for pound was actually popularized by the media for Robinson. He was the origin, the blueprint of that title. He was not the best in hindsight. It's not we're going back in time and saying he was the best. He was acknowledged to be the best at the time. The great Muhammad Ali said, Sugar Ray Robinson was my idol, the greatest of all time. Jack LaMotta said, I fought Ray 6 times, pound for pound, the best fighter that ever lived. And Jack LaMotta was a great fighter. Now, clearly, Ray Robinson, he ticks all the boxes. Great victories, great competition, great cultural impact, great boxing intelligence. He clearly had it all. So he is the benchmark. Let's take another fighter, Jack Johnson. When we take a fighter like Jack Johnson, he has great achievements, but he also has that amazing cultural impact. And we had the boxing innovation using the low hands to draw in counterattacks, and he engaged in what we now call clinch science, the underhooks, the one-arm tie-ups, tying the one arm and then letting the other arm go, and putting your head on an opponent's chest to minimize the target. Jack Johnson, in this sense, was important for the evolution of boxing. And we can ask the questions, how competitive was Jack Johnson's era? Well, James J. Jeffries, he was undefeated, and that was a big victory. He did have that great cultural impact, and of course he had great boxing intelligence, the pace control, the clinch science, etc. And don't forget the domination that Jack Johnson had. He kept the belt for 7 years. But then you have people that are not on many people's top 20 lists, and you wonder why. Let me give you an example. Joe Calzaghe, great fighter. He had dominance. I mean, he was undefeated. Great boxing intelligence. It's funny because Joe Calzaghe actually had fragile hands. But what he did, he went from being a hard puncher to shortening his punches and taking the power off the punches. And then he became like a skillful boxer, volume puncher. And that was the evolution of his boxing, to be able to to be able to compete in boxing because of his fragile hands, I believed he wasn't able to put the full meat into the shots. And when we talk about cultural impact, in Britain, Joe Calzaghe had a cultural impact, but the skeptics would argue that he didn't have that cultural impact worldwide. And further to this, skeptics would argue that, yes, he had a win over Hopkins and Roy Jones, but it wasn't a win over a prime Hopkins or a prime Roy Jones. And for that reason, many people don't put Joe Calzaghe in the top 20. Many people like myself, would consider him perhaps to be the greatest British fighter of all time. I guess it's a toss-up between Joe Calzaghe and Lennox Lewis, but many don't put him in the top 20. And here's the problem. The top 20 is subjective. It's so subjective. It's not objective. Many people will have Crawford on that list. Some will have him in the top 15. Some will have him in the top 10. Some may even have him in the top 5, while others may not even have him in the top 20. There is so much subjectivity to have a clear, universally accepted opinion. Personally, I think Crawford is a legend, and we just need to appreciate him.
What's going on with Artur Beterbiev? Once the feared powerhouse of 175 pounds, he's now coming off his first professional loss, a 12-round decision to Dmitry Bivol that stripped him of his undisputed titles. At 40, the aura of invincibility has cracked, and questions loom. Is he evolving or overthinking? With the Bivol trilogy on hold, his November fight with Dion Nicholson could define the final chapter of his career.
So what has happened to Beterbiev? What has happened to Beterbiev? I mean, the media has just become really silent. Beterbiev is silent. The boxing purists are silent. I mean, what's going on? There was so much talk beforehand about his domination, so much talk about the power. I'm just wondering, why is everyone silent? Now, of course, in February 2025, Beterbiev lost a majority decision to Dmitry Bivol in their rematch. It was his first loss, but it was a tremendous fight. And he actually went 12 rounds, which is significant because it's just rare for him to go the distance. Has he ever been the distance before, or has he knocked out everyone? But in that fight, he made adjustments, and he made good adjustments. But then Bivol made even greater adjustments and went into what I call matrix mode. And what's surprising, well, maybe it's not surprising, but the trilogy between Beterbiev and Bivol has been put on ice. And actually, Beterbiev has announced that he will fight Dion Nicholson on November the 22nd. So that means, by default, the trilogy is on hold, and Beterbiev has publicly blamed Bivol, stating his camp are avoiding the third fight. So it appears that maybe there's some promotional politics to be involved, but there may be some economic implications here as well, because I believe that the pay-per-view economically wasn't a success. Now, culturally, or to the boxing purist, it was a success. It was a tremendous fight, but I believe it didn't do great numbers, and maybe there was a greater expectation with regards to the numbers. However, there's been some other interesting developments, like in some recent training footage, Beterbiev was seen punching from a southpaw stance, which is unusual because he's an orthodox fighter. So he mostly fights from, his left hand here and his left foot forward. But it appears that he's making some tactical shifts. And this could be maybe part of his evolution. And it may suggest that he's working on adaptability by mixing stances or disguising attacks, or maybe he's trying to be less predictable. However, when I look at that, I think to myself, if Beterbiev is trying to be too technical, would this negatively affect him? Because it might not be a positive thing, because in the trilogy, if it does happen, surely he would want it to be a fight, not a technical match. If he goes into the trilogy and tries to have a technical boxing match with Bivol, surely that's playing into Bivol's hands. But there's also another possibility. Maybe this is mind games. But I'm not saying that implementing adaptability and maybe punching from different angles is a bad thing. I'm saying trying to go into the trilogy with the mindset of making it a technical fight would not be beneficial for his identity. There's also some other questions and some other things to consider. Now, Beterbiev is 40, so that means within the boxing context, he is no longer a younger fighter. And this loss, some could say, could signal that he's starting to slow down. Now, I'm not sure about that, because I just think that Bivol was exceptional. Beterbiev was good. He's always good. But Bivol was exceptional. And that was the difference. Now, when we talk about age in boxing, generally speaking, getting older in boxing is not going to be good. Why is that? Because it will affect your speed, and it will affect your reflexes, and it will affect your feet. And all of those things are very, very crucial in boxing. However, we do have some references. For example, when we look at Bernard Hopkins. Bernard Hopkins seemed to get better with age. But there's a distinction here. Bernard Hopkins was an intelligent fighter. He wasn't a powerhouse. He used intelligent tactics to disarm his opponents. Then we have the George Foreman reference. In his second career, he made changes to be effective. He still punched incredibly hard, but he increased his accuracy, awareness, and he increased his boxing intelligence. He set traps. He walked his opponents into punches. So these are two references where age hasn't hindered the performance of a fighter. But I do feel that Beterbiev's style of immense power and immense pressure, age could hinder. It could hinder him. Of course it could. And then there's the other element about the evolution in sports nutrition and the evolution in sports exercise. Can that prolong a boxer's career? Is 40 the new 30? It's really hard to qualify. Then you've got the genetics of the individual. Some people are just built differently. They can have longer careers. There's many variables to this, and there's no easy answer. And I believe Teddy Atlas stated that the ring is the chamber of truth. And I guess we're only going to get the answer to these questions when Beterbiev enters the chamber of truth again. The Nicholson fight, of course, could be critical. A strong showing, a dominant win. It may reopen doors to big fights. And these big fights could be with Benavidez, rematch with Yard, or that trilogy with Bivol. The risk, though, because every action can have a potential positive or negative reaction, the risk is that misstep, which could punish him from further elite title contention. So I guess there's some questions to ask here. And one of the questions is, how did that rematch with Bivol affect Beterbiev, not just physically, but did it affect him mentally? Should he change his fighting identity due to the loss, or should he maintain his fighting identity? And what adjustments could Bivol make to be triumphant in the trilogy? That's a good question. What adjustments would he need to make to increase the likelihood of being victorious? And if he does make those adjustments, because Bivol's an intelligent fighter, he will make adjustments on the adjustments, and then will Bivol be able to make those further adjustments? Also, well, it's not a decision, is it? But is the fact that the trilogy being delayed, a strategic move, or is it just the impact of certain promotional issues? And does Beterbiev fighting Dion Nicholson, does that tell us something about Beterbiev's confidence? And does it tell us something about his positioning in the division? And what's behind that new strategy of training southpaw? Is it just a random video, or is it a real strategic shift? And how long more does Beterbiev have? How much more does he have? And these are some interesting questions, because Beterbiev is still an elite fighter and a very powerful puncher. A very powerful puncher. He was brutalizing everyone. And I guess the other thing is, psychologically, does this change the dynamic? Because when you fight Beterbiev, that must do something to a fighter psychologically, in terms of, you're thinking, how hard does he hit? And, what do I have to do? It must be a psychological experience to fight him. But does that change? Does that change because of what happened with the rematch with Bivol? So there's some interesting developments here, but hopefully the silence will stop.
Joe, the undefeated pride of Wales, reigned supreme for 11 years with 21 title defences, blending skill, intelligence and adaptability. From outlasting Eubank to dismantling Lacey and outsmarting Kessler, he solved every puzzle in front of him. Battling hand injuries, he evolved into a dazzling volume puncher, overwhelming foes with rhythm like jazz. Praised by legends and feared by rivals, his legacy sparks debate. Is Joe, alongside Lennox Lewis, the greatest British fighter ever?
Joe Calzaghe was the undefeated pride of Wales. And I think people really don't give Joe Calzaghe the flowers he deserves. I mean, he was undefeated. He was a world champion. And he had a domination period, I believe, of over 11 years. 21 defenses. I think it speaks for itself. His victory over Eubank showed that he was a warrior, because when it got tough, Calzaghe got going, and Eubank pulled him into the jungle. He gave him, I believe Calzaghe said it was his hardest fight, but he showed what he was made of. And his victory over Lacey was dominant. We have to remember the context. We have to remember the context of this fight. Lacey was a rising star. He was the overwhelming favorite. And Calzaghe not only destroyed Lacey, he possibly destroyed his whole career. And the one thing that Calzaghe had, he had a lot, but he had superior boxing intelligence. He made the adjustments. He made adjustments against Kessler. He stayed in the pocket. He got hit with that hard right uppercut, I believe in round 4. But then he decided to come out of the pocket and pick him off with the punches. He used his volume punching and angles and made it an outside fight. He solved the puzzle. He solved every puzzle. His boxing, in a sense, figuratively speaking, was like jazz. He could change his rhythm. He could adapt. And let's not forget that Joe Calzaghe actually had hand issues. He had hand issues. And I think this was an incredible part about his style. He adapted his style to be able to continue his career. Because Calzaghe, at the beginning of his career, used to sit on his punches, used to put power into his punches. But then he evolved into a volume puncher as opposed to punching with authority. This was an important part of his evolution because of his hand issues, he wasn't able to maintain his previous style. So he changed his style and made it even more effective. many people, as I've stated that some people don't give Calzaghe his due credit, but there are many people that do give him his credit. I mean, this was like a backhanded compliment from Kessler, but he said his punches weren't particularly hard, but it was confusing when he hit you 20 times. Indeed, Joe Calzaghe was such a volume puncher. Sugar Ray Leonard, the great Sugar Ray Leonard, what an amazing fighter he was. He stated within 2 rounds, I was a Calzaghe supporter, and he was referring to that Jeff Lacey fight. And Carl Froch, who was kind of like a nemesis of Joe Calzaghe, even though they didn't fight, stated that he believed that Calzaghe could have beaten Ward. And Andre Ward, again, was another elite fighter who was undefeated. And in a way, there were many fights with Calzaghe that didn't happen that you wish did happen. For example, I think the Carl Froch fight would have been a great fight. Carl Froch is a phenomenal puncher, and Joe Calzaghe is a phenomenal boxer, a southpaw. The volume punching against the power would have been a great fight, but it also would have been a great event. Also, it would be interesting, and this fight couldn't happen because they came at slightly different times. But how would Joe Calzaghe have fared, or what would the fight look like against the prime Sergey Kovalev? And when I say Sergey Kovalev, I mean the prime Sergey Kovalev. I'm talking about the Sergey Kovalev that was obliterating everyone. The one that, totally destroyed Nathan Cleverly, respectively. The one who had that dominant reign that was scoring knockouts with jabs to the body. That would have been a really good fight. That would have been a really good event. And even though Joe Calzaghe beat Roy Jones, even though he beat Bernard Hopkins, some people, the skeptics, say he needed to be a prime Roy Jones and a prime Bernard Hopkins to really elevate his career. And I can understand that perspective. I'm not sure I agree, but I can understand it. But even with that being said, you could ask the question, is Joe Calzaghe the greatest British fighter of all time? Is he the greatest British boxer of all time? And I think many would say yes to that question. Of course, I would say that he's neck and neck with Lennox Lewis. And of course, Lennox Lewis had a phenomenal career. Lennox Lewis was a phenomenal talent. And he had he was dominant in the heavyweight division. And a lot of people didn't want to fight Lennox Lewis. But you have to give Joe Calzaghe his just due. You have to give him his credit. I believe at the beginning of his career, there was this prevailing belief that he was a protected fighter. And that myth, I think, really hurt his career. But I feel like that is a misconception, especially when he took the Jeff Lacey fight, because the Jeff Lacey fight was at the time a dangerous fight. Of course, in hindsight, we could say, Jeff Lacey wasn't that good. But at the time, he was the rising star. And Joe Calzaghe, like a warrior, took the risk. He took the fight. And he didn't only win the fight, he won the fight convincingly. Kessler was another dangerous opponent, very dangerous opponent. He took the fight, he stayed too long in the pocket, he got hurt, and he came back. The Eubank fight was a dangerous fight to take at the time because of Eubank's championship credibility and his championship level experience. So you've got to give him his flowers. And even, Bernard Hopkins is one of those unique fighters that had a successful second career. And even after he lost to Calzaghe, he still had some good wins. So even though you could argue it wasn't a prime Bernard Hopkins, it was still a good Bernard Hopkins. It was still an experienced Bernard Hopkins. It was still a capable Bernard Hopkins. And that, I think, was a very difficult puzzle to solve. And Bernard Hopkins presented a high level of difficulty. That was That was a fight that consisted of high ring IQ. But Joe Calzaghe, he solved the puzzle. He always solved the puzzle. And he definitely deserves an amazing amount of respect, because I think Joe Calzaghe, arguably the best British fighter of all time. Again, it's neck and neck with Lennox Lewis. But one thing we have to say is that Joe Calzaghe was an elite level fighter. He was an elite level boxer.